Welcome to my channel. Here, we share inspiring stories of brave and strong people. Maybe you'll see yourself or someone you know in these stories. Thank you for watching. Sam Reynolds didn't need anyone. His small house by the harbor was enough. The silence a companion he'd come to prefer. But on the night of the storm, everything changed. The winds battered the town, rattling windows and tearing at rooftops. While Sam sat by his fire, content to let the world rage outside. Then he saw it, a sinking boat, and something small struggling in the waves. It wasn't his problem. Not really. But as the rain hammered the glass and memories of past rescues stirred, Sam found himself pulling on his boots. What he pulled from the water that night wasn't just a scruffy orange cat. It was the beginning of a journey he never thought he'd take. Leave a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey tomorrow. Sam's life was like the tides that lapped against the rocky shoreline of his small coastal town, steady, predictable, and unyielding. Each day began the same. At dawn, he'd make his bed with military precision, smoothing out the corners until the sheets were taut. The house, modest and weathered by the salty air, bore the faint scent of the sea. A single photograph on the mantel, framed in brass, showed a younger Sam in his navy whites, standing beside a smiling woman with windswept hair. That woman, his wife Helen, had been the anchor of his life. Her loss 10 years ago had left him adrift, and though he'd survived storms far worse at sea, this loneliness felt insurmountable. Sam filled his days with routine. Mornings were for coffee on the porch, overlooking the harbor as fishermen prepared their boats. Afternoons, he tinkered in his shed, repairing nets or carving small wooden boats that no one else saw. He rarely spoke to the townsfolk, save for a curt nod at the grocer or a brief exchange at the bait shop. His solitude was a choice, or so he told himself. The storm rolled in late one afternoon, dark clouds gathering like a fleet on the horizon. Sam watched from his window as the first drops of rain began to streak the glass. The wind howled, rattling the shutters, and soon the waves in the harbor churned with restless energy. It was the kind of storm that reminded Sam of nights spent navigating treacherous waters, his crew depending on him to guide them to safety. He thought he'd left that life behind, but the sea had a way of pulling him back. As the storm intensified, Sam noticed something unusual through the rain-slicked glass. A fishing boat, small and ill-equipped for such weather, struggled against the surging waves. Its engine sputtered, and the vessel listed dangerously to one side. Sam's heart clenched. No one should be out in weather like this. Grabbing his raincoat, Sam stepped into the gale. The wind tore at him, and the rain stung his face like needles. He made his way to the end of the dock, his boots slipping on the wet planks. From this vantage point, he could see the boat more clearly. It was sinking, its bow nearly submerged. He scanned the water, searching for any sign of the crew, but the storm obscured everything. And then he saw it, a flash of orange amid the gray. At first, he thought it was debris, but then it moved. A cat, drenched and clinging to a piece of wood, its eyes wide with terror. Sam hesitated. What could he do for an animal out here? But as he watched the small creature struggle against the waves, something inside him stirred. He couldn't leave it. Sam untied his small skiff, a sturdy rowboat he'd kept in good condition despite rarely using it. The wind fought him every step of the way as he rowed toward the struggling cat. Each pull of the oars was a battle, the waves threatening to capsize the boat at any moment. By the time he reached the piece of flotsam, his arms burned, and his breath came in gasps. Easy now, he muttered, reaching out. The cat hissed. Its fur slicked flat against its body, but it didn't have the strength to resist. Sam scooped it up, cradling the shivering bundle against his chest. The cat's claws dug into his coat, but he didn't flinch. He turned the skiff around and rowed back to shore, the storm still raging around him. Once back on solid ground, Sam carried the cat inside, dripping water onto the floor. He placed it on an old towel near the fireplace and quickly lit a fire. The flames crackled to life, casting a warm glow that began to chase the chill from the room. The cat stayed where he'd placed it, trembling and silent. Sam fetched another towel and gently dried its fur, murmuring words of reassurance he hadn't used in years. As the fire warmed the room, the cat began to stir. It lifted its head, blinking at Sam with wary green eyes. Its fur was a patchwork of orange and white, scruffy and matted from the ordeal. Sam stepped back, unsure of what to do next. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for anything beyond getting the cat out of the water. "You'll be gone tomorrow," he said aloud, though the room felt emptier than before. He told himself he'd take the cat to the shelter first thing in the morning. He didn't need a pet. He didn't need anyone. But as the night wore on, Sam found himself glancing at the small creature by the fire. It had curled into a tight ball, its sides rising and falling with each breath. Something about the sight tugged at him. He'd been a rescuer his whole life, men, ships, even himself after Helen passed. And now, it seemed, a scruffy orange cat had joined that list. Sam sat down in his chair, staring into the fire. The storm outside began to subside, the wind lessening its grip on the town. But inside, another kind of storm brewed. Sam wasn't ready to admit it, but for the first time in years, his house didn't feel quite so empty. The morning after the storm, Sam awoke to the sound of something crashing onto the floor. Disoriented, he sat up and rubbed his eyes. The events of the previous night coming back in pieces. The storm, the sinking boat, the cat. Another crash followed by a soft thud jolted him fully awake. He threw on his robe and shuffled into the living room, where he found the orange tabby, damp but alive, pawing at the mantel. The cat's tail flicked wildly as it batted at the brass-framed photograph of Sam and Helen. "Hey! Stop that!" Sam barked, hurrying across the room. The cat froze, ears flattened, before leaping down and darting under the couch. Sam sighed, picking up the frame. A faint crack now marred the glass, and his jaw tightened as he traced it with his finger. He set the photo back in its place and turned toward the couch. "All right. Come on out," he muttered, crouching to peer underneath. Two green eyes stared back at him, unblinking. Sam reached a hand forward, but the cat hissed and retreated further into the shadows, resisting the urge to grumble. He stood and walked to the kitchen. A saucer of milk might lure it out, he reasoned. He poured a small amount and placed it on the floor before retreating to the kitchen table. Rusty emerged cautiously, sniffing the air. It took a tentative sip, then another, before finishing the milk and licking its lips. Sam watched in silence, his arms crossed. "Your trouble. You know that," he said finally. The cat's only response was to hop onto a chair and begin grooming itself. Sam groaned. Over the next few hours, the cat continued to explore its new surroundings, with no regard for Sam's meticulously organized home. Rusty leapt onto the kitchen counter, knocking over a tin of sugar. It tangled itself in the netting Sam had been repairing, and, most audaciously, it found his old Navy compass, dragging the brass instrument across the floor as if it were a toy. When Sam saw the compass lying on its side, his heart clenched. He picked it up and held it in his palm, the cool metal smooth against his skin. Memories of Helen flooded back, unbidden. "You'll always find your way back to me," she had said, her voice as soft as the waves on a calm day. She had given him the compass just before his final deployment, insisting that even if the sea kept them apart, it would guide him home. He'd kept it with him every day since, even after she was gone. Rusty meowed, breaking the moment. Sam shook his head and placed the compass back on the shelf. By mid-afternoon, Sam had decided he couldn't keep the cat. He wasn't equipped for this kind of disruption. A pet meant responsibility, and he'd built his life to avoid anything that might tether him too tightly. He called the local animal shelter, hoping to drop the cat off. But the woman on the other end of the line informed him they were at capacity. "We can put you on a waiting list," she offered. Sam hung up without responding. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sam sat on his porch, The cat curled up on the doormat. He'd fed it a can of tuna, and now it seemed content to stay close. Sam stared out at the harbor. The quiet broken only by the distant cries of seagulls and the occasional lapping of waves against the dock. "Don't get comfortable," he said aloud, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cat or himself. But as the days passed, Rusty began to settle in. And despite his gruff demeanor, Sam found himself adapting. He couldn't deny the strange comfort in having another living presence in the house. The cat's antics, though often irritating, brought life to a space that had long felt lifeless. Sam remained guarded, refusing to name the cat or acknowledge that it might be more than a temporary guest. Yet, he caught himself watching it with a faint smile as it chased a piece of string or curled up in the patch of sunlight on the floor. One evening, as Sam sat by the fire carving a small wooden boat, Rusty jumped onto his lap. Sam stiffened but didn't push the cat away. Instead, he let it settle, its warmth a quiet weight against him. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. He ran his hand absent-mindedly over the cat's fur, his thoughts drifting back to Helen. She'd always wanted a pet, but Sam had refused, citing their frequent moves and his long absences at sea. "Maybe when we're old and settled," he'd said. But they'd never gotten the chance. Rusty purred, a low, soothing sound that filled the room. Sam closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him. For the first time, they didn't feel like waves threatening to pull him under. Instead, they were gentle, like the tide coming in. "Maybe you're not so bad," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Rusty's purring grew louder in response, as if in agreement. For now, Sam decided, the cat could stay. Just for now. Sam awoke to the sound of silence, a strange sensation after weeks of Rusty's constant presence. The cat wasn't curled up on the doormat or purring by the fire. The house felt emptier than it had since before the storm. He frowned, scanning the small living room. His gaze fell on the slightly ajar front door. "Damn cat," Sam muttered, grabbing his coat. The door creaked as he swung it open, the crisp morning air nipping at his face. Outside, the town was just beginning to stir. Fishing boats bobbed gently in the harbor, their nets piled high in preparation for the day's work. Sam scanned the area but saw no sign of the orange tabby. He sighed, tugging his cap lower as he stepped off the porch and headed down the narrow path leading to the docks. He hadn't spoken to many of his neighbors in years. Most greeted him with polite nods or a brief morning, Sam, but the conversations rarely went beyond that. Today, however, he had no choice. Rusty's absence gnawed at him in a way he didn't want to admit. As he passed the small cafe on the corner, the door swung open, and Maggie stepped out, a tray of freshly baked muffins in hand. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with salt and pepper hair tied back in a loose bun and a warmth that seemed to radiate even in the cold morning air. "Sam, good morning," she called, her voice lilting with the cheer of someone used to drawing others out of their shells. Sam nodded gruffly. "Morning. Haven't seen you out this early in a while. Everything all right?" Maggie's eyes twinkled, though her smile softened when she noticed the concern etched on his face. He hesitated, feeling foolish. "Looking for a cat. Rusty. Orange. Seen him?" Maggie's face lit up. "Oh. That little troublemaker? He ran by here not long ago, heading toward the docks. Didn't know you had a cat." "Sam. I don't," he replied quickly, though the words rang hollow even to him. She chuckled. "Well, good luck finding him. If you're hungry after your search, come on in. Coffee's on me." Sam grumbled a thanks and continued toward the docks, where he spotted Jake unloading crates from his fishing boat. The young man, barely out of his 20s, was wiry and quick, his sun-bleached hair sticking out from beneath a faded cap. He looked up as Sam approached, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Morning, Mr. Reynolds. What brings you down here?" Jake's tone was friendly, though tinged with surprise. Sam rarely ventured this far into town unless absolutely necessary. "Looking for a cat," Sam said, his voice gruff but not unkind. Orange. Scruffy. Seen him? Jake scratched his head. Think I saw him by the bait shop earlier. He was sniffing around the crates. Want me to help you look? Sam hesitated. And used to accepting help. But he nodded. Sure. Thanks. Together, they walked along the dock, calling for Rusty. Sam felt out of place, not just because of the cat, but because of the easy camaraderie that seemed to exist among the fishermen and townsfolk. He distanced himself from it for so long that stepping back into it felt foreign, like wearing a uniform that no longer fit. You know, Jake said after a moment, I've seen you with that cat a few times now. He seems to stick close to you. Sam grunted. Not by choice. Jake laughed. Seems like he's adopted you. Whether you like it or not. They found Rusty near the bait shop, perched on a stack of crates and eyeing a flock of seagulls. The cat's tail twitched as if contemplating an attack. Sam let out a low whistle, and Rusty's ears perked up. The cat turned, meeting Sam's gaze with a look that bordered on indifference. Come here, you little pest, Sam muttered, scooping the cat into his arms. Rusty protested with a soft meow but didn't struggle. As they walked back toward Sam's house, Rusty's escapades seemed to spark something in the town. Children pointed and giggled at the scruffy tabby. And even the adults paused to smile. That your cat? Sam, one man called from the post office steps. Looks like trouble, another remarked with a grin. Sam found himself nodding and responding, though the attention made him uneasy. Rusty, oblivious to the commotion he'd caused, purred softly in Sam's arms. Back at home, Sam set the cat down and closed the door firmly behind him. Rusty stretched lazily before curling up in the patch of sunlight on the floor. Sam watched him for a moment, a faint smile tugging at his lips despite himself. The house felt different now. Not just because of the cat, but because of the brief interactions he'd had with the town. It reminded him of a time when he'd been part of something larger, when his life had been full of purpose and connection. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Sam sat down at the kitchen table, his thoughts drifting. Rusty's presence had drawn people to him in a way he hadn't expected. It was as if the cat's mischievous energy had broken through the walls he'd built around himself, leaving him exposed but not entirely uncomfortable. For now, he decided, he'd let the cat stay. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but the little troublemaker had started to fill the quiet corners of his life with something he'd almost forgotten: warmth. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel, it means so much to us. Now, let's get back to the story. Sam was halfway through mending a fishing net in his shed when he heard a hesitant knock on the door. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened it to find Jake standing there, holding a worn notebook and looking unsure of himself. Mr. Reynolds, Jake began, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I was wondering if you could help me with something. Sam raised an eyebrow. He wasn't used to people asking for his help, and Jake's nervous demeanor piqued his curiosity. What kind of something? Jake held up the notebook. I've been trying to learn more about navigation, the old-fashioned way. You know, charts, sextants, that sort of thing. I figured, with your Navy background, you might know a thing or two. Sam hesitated. It had been years since he'd handled a sextant or plotted a course on a paper chart. These days, everything was done with GPS and electronic tools. But something about Jake's earnest expression stirred a memory of himself as a young sailor, eager to learn. Come on in, Sam said gruffly, stepping aside. Jake's face lit up as he followed Sam into the shed. The space was cluttered but orderly, filled with tools, coils of rope, and a small workbench piled with projects. Rusty sat perched on a high shelf, lazily watching them with half-closed eyes. Sam cleared a space on the bench and pulled out an old leather-bound book from a nearby shelf. This is a star chart, he said, flipping it open to a page filled with intricate diagrams of constellations. We used to navigate by the stars before all this modern technology. Jake leaned in, fascinated. So, you could figure out where you were just by looking at the sky? Sam nodded. If you knew what to look for and had the right tools. It's not as fast as GPS, but it's reliable. The stars don't fail you. He pulled out a weathered sextant from a drawer and handed it to Jake. The young man turned it over in his hands, examining the brass instrument with awe. "This was yours?" Jake asked. Sam's mouth quirked into a faint smile. "Used it for years. It's older than you are, but it'll still get the job done." As Sam explained the basics of using the sextant, Rusty decided to make his presence known. The cat leapt down from the shelf and landed squarely on the open star chart, scattering papers in every direction. Jake laughed as Rusty batted at a dangling piece of string, oblivious to the chaos he'd caused. "You've got yourself a curious first mate," Jake said, grinning as he picked up a fallen sheet. Sam rolled his eyes but couldn't suppress a chuckle. "He's more trouble than he's worth." The lesson continued, with Sam demonstrating how to take readings with the sextant and plot them on a chart. Jake was a quick learner, asking thoughtful questions and eagerly jotting down notes in his notebook. Sam found himself enjoying the process more than he expected. It had been a long time since he'd shared this knowledge with anyone, and seeing Jake's enthusiasm rekindled something in him that he thought he'd lost. As the afternoon wore on, Sam began to share stories from his Navy days. He spoke of navigating treacherous waters during storms, of nights spent on deck under a canopy of stars, and of the camaraderie among the crew. His voice was steady, but there was a wistfulness in his tone that hinted at emotions he kept buried. Jake listened intently, occasionally asking questions or sharing his own experiences as a fisherman. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by Rusty's antics as the cat pawed at the sextant or tried to climb onto Sam's shoulder. At one point, Jake asked, "What made you join the Navy, Mr. Reynolds?" Sam paused, his gaze drifting to the far corner of the shed where Helen's photo sat on a small shelf. "I wanted to see the world," he said after a moment. "But more than that, I wanted to feel like I was part of something bigger. Out there on the sea, you realize how small you are, but also how important it is to do your part." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that's why I love fishing. It's hard work, but it feels real. Like you're connected to something." "It is," Sam agreed. "But don't lose sight of where you came from. The old ways still have value, even in a world that's always rushing to move forward." The lesson ended as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light across the harbor. Jake thanked Sam profusely, promising to practice what he'd learned and return for another lesson soon. After Jake left, Sam stood in the doorway of the shed, watching the fading light. Rusty rubbed against his leg, purring loudly. Sam reached down to scratch behind the cat's ears, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're not much of a navigator," he said, "but I guess you're good company." Rusty meowed in response, as if agreeing. For the first time in years, Sam felt a flicker of purpose. Teaching Jake had reminded him of the things he'd once loved about the sea, about the skills he'd spent a lifetime honing. It wasn't just about passing on knowledge, it was about reconnecting with a part of himself he'd nearly forgotten. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sam glanced up and felt a quiet sense of peace. The sea had always been his guide, and now, perhaps, it was leading him back to something he thought he'd lost. The storm came suddenly, sweeping across the small coastal town with the fury of a tide unbound. Sam watched from his porch as rain lashed against the harbor, the sky an ominous gray that seemed to swallow the horizon. He glanced down at Rusty, who had curled himself into a tight ball on the rug. The cat's ears twitched at the sound of thunder, but he didn't stir. Sam's thoughts wandered to the storm weeks ago, the night he'd pulled Rusty from the water. He couldn't imagine losing the cat now, not after everything. The wind howled louder, and Sam got up to check the windows. When he returned, Rusty was gone. At first, Sam assumed the cat had wandered to another room, but a quick search of the small house turned up nothing. Panic settled in his chest as he noticed the door ajar, the wind whipping it back and forth. "Rusty," he called, stepping onto the porch. The rain was unrelenting, soaking him within seconds. He squinted into the storm, hoping to catch a flash of orange fur. Nothing. The fear that gripped him was immediate and visceral. He grabbed his coat and headed into the storm, his boots slipping on the slick ground. Sam's search took him first to the docks, where the wind tore at the tarps covering the fishing boats. "Rusty," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the churning waves for a brief, heart-stopping moment. The scene triggered a memory. Unbidden and sharp, he was back on the deck of a Navy ship, the rain hammering against his face as he scanned the water for any sign of a man overboard. The ship had been caught in a storm much like this one, and a young crewmate, eager but inexperienced, had been swept into the sea. Sam had been the one to spot him, clinging to a piece of debris, and he'd risked his own life to pull the man back aboard. But the rescue had come too late. The cold had already claimed him. Sam shook his head, forcing the memory aside. This wasn't then. He couldn't let it be. At the corner cafe, Maggie was locking up when she saw Sam trudging through the storm, his coat plastered to his back and his face set in grim determination. She hurried to the door, her umbrella snapping open against the wind. "Sam, what are you doing out in this?" she called, her voice full of concern. "Rusty's missing," he said. His words clipped. Maggie's expression softened. "Let me help. Jake's still down at the harbor, he'll want to know." Together, they made their way toward the docks. Maggie called out for Rusty as they went, her voice steady and reassuring despite the chaos around them. By the time they reached Jake, the young fisherman was already pulling on a rain slicker. "We'll find him, Mr. Reynolds," Jake said with a confidence that Sam found both comforting and infuriating. The three of them combed the town, their voices echoing through the empty streets. Sam's anxiety grew with each passing minute. He couldn't shake the image of Rusty caught in the storm, the cat's small body no match for the ferocity of the elements. They reached the shoreline just as the rain began to lighten. The rocks were slick and treacherous, the waves crashing against them in relentless rhythm. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing to a small, huddled shape on the rocks. Sam's heart leapt. It was Rusty, perched precariously on a narrow ledge, his fur plastered to his body. The cat let out a weak, plaintive meow as Sam approached. "Hold this," Sam said, thrusting his coat at Jake. Without waiting for a response, he began to climb down the rocks. "Sam, be careful," Maggie called, her voice tight with worry. The rocks were slick beneath Sam's hands, each step a calculated risk. The memory of his Navy crewmate resurfaced, vivid and haunting. He could still feel the icy grip of the water, the weight of a life slipping through his fingers. But this time, he wouldn't let go. When he reached Rusty, the cat's eyes met his, wide with fear but filled with trust. Sam scooped him up, holding him close to his chest as he began to climb back. The wind bit at his face, and the waves surged around him. But he focused on each step, refusing to falter. Finally, he reached the top, where Maggie and Jake were waiting. Maggie let out a breath she'd been holding, and Jake helped steady Sam as he stepped onto solid ground. "Got him," Sam said, his voice rough with relief. Rusty let out a small, grateful purr, his head tucked under Sam's chin. Back at the house, Sam dried Rusty off with a towel, his hands trembling slightly. The cat's usual feistiness was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment as he curled up in Sam's lap. Sam ran a hand over the cat's damp fur, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. Maggie and Jake stayed for a while, warming up by the fire and sharing quiet conversation. The storm outside had passed, leaving the night calm and still. "You've got yourself a brave little companion there," Maggie said, smiling at Rusty. Sam nodded, his gaze fixed on the cat. "He's more than that," he said softly. As his guests left, Sam sat by the fire, Rusty still in his lap. The house, once a place of solitude, now felt full of warmth, of connection, of something he hadn't felt in years. He glanced at the cat, who looked back at him with sleepy eyes. And for the first time, Sam allowed himself to believe that he wasn't alone. The morning after the storm, Sam sat on his porch with a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. Rusty lay curled up beside him, purring softly, his orange fur brighter than the pale sunlight filtering through the clouds. The town was quiet, still recovering from the previous night's chaos. Sam stared out at the harbor, his thoughts uncharacteristically restless. The memory of finding Rusty on the rocks had stayed with him. Not just for the relief, but for the fear it stirred. He'd felt the same helplessness that had haunted him since his Navy days. For years, he'd locked away those emotions, building walls to keep the pain at bay. But as he'd cradled the shivering cat in his arms, something inside him had shifted. Maybe, he thought, it was time to let go of some of the weight he'd carried for so long. Rusty stretched and nuzzled against Sam's leg, pulling him back to the present. He smiled faintly, scratching the cat behind the ears. "You're a troublemaker," he said softly, "but I guess you're worth it." Later that week, Sam found himself at the cafe, a place he'd avoided for years. Maggie greeted him with a broad smile as he stepped through the door, Rusty trotting at his heels. The cat had quickly become a fixture in town, and the cafe was no exception. Customers called out to him, offering scraps of food or a quick scratch behind the ears. Rusty accepted the attention with the air of someone who knew he belonged. "Well, look who's decided to join the living," Maggie teased as Sam approached the counter. He chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. "Figured I'd see what all the fuss is about." Maggie poured him a cup of coffee, her expression softening. "It's good to see you, Sam. And that little guy, too. He's been the talk of the town." Sam glanced at Rusty, who had curled up on a chair near the window, basking in a patch of sunlight. "He's got a way of drawing people in," Sam admitted. As the cafe buzzed around them, Maggie sat down across from Sam. She told him about the storm damage to her roof and how the townsfolk had come together to help fix it. Gradually, their conversation shifted to deeper topics. Maggie spoke of her late husband, who had passed away 5 years earlier, and how running the cafe had helped her cope with the loneliness. "It's not the same, of course," she said, her eyes misting. "But it gives me a reason to get up every day. A way to stay connected. That's what matters." Sam nodded, her words resonating in a way he hadn't expected. "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "After Helen, I didn't know how to move forward. I thought keeping to myself would make it easier. But maybe it just made it harder." Maggie reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "Sometimes it takes something, or someone, to remind us we're not alone." Sam's gaze drifted to Rusty, who was now playfully batting at the hem of a customer's coat. A small smile tugged at his lips. Over the following weeks, Sam's routine began to change. He started spending more time in town, stopping by the cafe for coffee or helping Jake with his boat. The young fisherman had taken to calling Sam his sea mentor, a title that made Sam grumble but secretly pleased him. Teaching Jake the old ways of navigation and sharing stories from his Navy days brought a sense of purpose he hadn't realized he'd missed. One afternoon, as they worked together to repair a torn fishing net, Jake turned to Sam. "You ever think about getting back out on the water?" he asked. Sam paused, the question catching him off guard. "Hadn't really thought about it," he admitted. "Been a long time since I felt like I had a reason to." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, you've got one now. You've got people who care about you, Mr. Reynolds. And maybe it's time you let them." The words lingered in Sam's mind as he walked home that evening, Rusty trotting faithfully by his side. Rusty's antics continued to endear him to the townsfolk. Children would run up to him in the street, their laughter ringing out as he chased after their makeshift toys. Even the gruffest fisherman couldn't resist giving him a scratch behind the ears. Rusty had become more than just a cat, he was a symbol of the town's warmth and resilience. A reminder of how small gestures could create connections. For Sam, Rusty had become a bridge, a way to reconnect not just with the town, but with himself. He still felt the pangs of loss, but they were no longer overwhelming. They had softened, like the tides retreating after a storm. One evening, as Sam sat by the fire with Rusty curled in his lap, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. The cat had entered his life uninvited, appending his carefully constructed solitude. But now, he couldn't imagine his days without Rusty's mischief or the quiet comfort of his presence. "Guess you've got me figured out," Sam said, scratching the cat's chin. Rusty purred in response, his eyes half closed. For the first time in years, Sam felt a sense of peace. The tides had turned, and he was ready to let them carry him forward. The sky was a deep, endless blue as Sam stood on the dock, gazing out at the calm sea. The morning air carried the faint scent of salt, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked bread from Maggie's cafe down the street. It was a day for new beginnings, though Sam had yet to admit that fully to himself. Rusty sat beside him, tail flicking as he watched seagulls swooping overhead. The cat had become a fixture in Sam's daily routine, a quiet but constant reminder of how much his life had changed in the past few months. "You ready for this, old boy?" Sam asked, his voice soft. Rusty meowed in response, as if encouraging him to move forward. Behind him, Jake's voice called out, breaking the stillness. "Boat's ready, Mr. Reynolds. Just waiting on the captain." Sam turned to see Jake standing by the small fishing boat they'd spent weeks repairing. The younger man's excitement was infectious, and Sam couldn't help but smile. "Captain." "Huh?" Sam muttered, shaking his head as he joined Jake. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves." Jake grinned. "You've earned it. Besides, I've got plenty to learn from you." They boarded the boat, Rusty hopping up with surprising agility. The engine hummed to life, and soon they were gliding out of the harbor, the town shrinking behind them. Sam felt a familiar pull in his chest as the open water stretched out before them, a mix of nostalgia and anticipation. The day unfolded with an ease Sam hadn't expected. He showed Jake how to read the waves, how to adjust the sails to make the most of the wind, and how to navigate using the sun and stars. Jake was an eager student, his enthusiasm reminding Sam of his younger self. Rusty provided his usual antics, batting at ropes and curling up in the coiled nets. At one point, the cat climbed onto the edge of the boat, balancing precariously as if daring the sea to test him. Jake laughed, snapping a quick photo on his phone. "He's fearless," Jake said, shaking his head. "More than I can say for some of us," Sam replied, though his tone held no bitterness. Instead, it was laced with a quiet admiration for the courage he'd rediscovered, not just in Rusty, but in himself. As the sun climbed higher, they anchored the boat near a small cove, a hidden gem Sam had discovered years ago. The water was clear and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. They ate a simple lunch of sandwiches Maggie had packed, the silence between them comfortable. Jake broke the quiet, his voice thoughtful. "You ever think about the old days? Back when you were in the Navy?" Sam nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "All the time. Some days it feels like another life, like it happened to someone else. Other days, it feels like I never left." Jake nodded. "I think it's cool that you still remember all this stuff, the navigation, the stories. Most people would have let it go by now." Sam glanced at him, a faint smile on his lips. "Some things are worth holding on to. They remind you of where you've been, who you are. But they're not everything. Sometimes you have to let new things in." Jake didn't respond immediately, but Sam could see the words sinking in. It was a conversation Sam wished he'd had with himself years ago. By late afternoon, they returned to the harbor, where Maggie was waiting with her apron dusted in flour and a smile that lit up the dock. "Well, how is it?" she asked as they stepped onto solid ground. "Good day," Sam said, his voice steady. "Felt right." Rusty leapt onto the dock, tail held high as he trotted toward Maggie, who knelt to greet him. "And you, little troublemaker, did you keep these two in line?" The cat purred loudly, rubbing against her hand. Sam watched the exchange, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the sun. That evening, Sam invited Maggie and Jake over for dinner. It was a simple affair: fresh fish Jake had caught, a loaf of bread Maggie had baked, and a bottle of wine Sam had dusted off from a cabinet he hadn't opened in years. They ate on the porch, the sound of waves providing a soothing backdrop. The conversation flowed easily, laughter mixing with stories of the day. Sam found himself sharing more than he ever had, recounting tales from his Navy days and memories of Helen. Maggie shared her own stories, and even Jake chimed in with dreams of one day owning his own fishing fleet. Rusty wandered among them, accepting scraps and attention with equal enthusiasm. At one point, he jumped onto Sam's lap, curling up contentedly. Sam rested a hand on the cat's back, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. As the evening wound down and the sky filled with stars, Sam walked Maggie and Jake to the gate. They said their goodbyes, and Sam lingered on the porch, looking out at the darkened harbor. Rusty joined him, stretching before settling at his feet. Sam gazed at the stars, the same ones he'd used to guide him through countless nights at sea. For the first time, he felt not just their beauty but their steadfastness, their quiet reminder that life's tides always turned. "We did all right, didn't we?" he said, glancing down at Rusty. The cat meowed softly, and Sam chuckled. "Yeah, I thought so." And with that, he turned and headed inside, the door closing behind him with a sense of finality, not of endings, but of new beginnings.